local history books. And he served on the city council and as mayor of Medina. And he's a third generation native of Seattle. And so he's well educated, knows history, served in politics, perfect person to discuss the politics of housing. So here's Mike Lewis.
Thank you very much. I love that bio. My mother wrote it. I would love to see you all, but I can't. So I'm going to presume you're all there, shining faces and ready to get rolling. So I'm going to start with a little story. I mentioned I was on the city council, so in Medina. So for those of you not familiar, the easiest way to say it is where Bill Gates lives. That's what everybody knows. And I only live here because of that third generation part. My grandparents moved out here 100 years ago, and when it was cheaper to move here than to move to Seattle. So I was on the city council and I got elected, and as a council manager form of government, so they had to pick a mayor on the first meeting, and I, through some very strange circumstances, ended up getting picked mayor. And I found out that at the next council meeting, we don't meet very often, next council meeting, we were going to be voting on to go to bid on a construction project that had been in the works for a while, a rebuilding of a road, 84th Avenue, which was really a miserable road. It was originally an old 2-lane road, and then it was expanded to 4 lanes, but they never striped it as 4 lanes. They only striped it as 2 lanes. So you had these huge lanes, and people would speed on the things, just awful. And they were going to put a median down the middle and rebuild the whole thing. I thought, this is great. I was so excited about this. Then I find out that the project had proceeded, but now going to bid, there were only 3 votes on the council to go to bid. And so I'm like, well, whoa, okay, so I got to go out and find another vote, 7-member council. And there were 2 council members who were absolutely never going to vote for this thing in a million years. One, probably not. And then another guy who had just joined the council like me, who'd indicated he wasn't really terribly in favor of it. And so I went and got a briefing from actually the adjacent city. They designed the project. We share the road. And they were telling me about it. One of the things they tell me is that they're going to be able to fix this structural problem in the road bed as part of this thing. The road had always been cracking in the wrong places. And oh, that's interesting. Nobody told me that. So anyway, not long after that, I run into my fellow council member. We're neighbors and out walking our dogs. And I say, hey, Jay, can I talk to you about this, about this vote? And here's why I think you should support it. And I'm talking to him, and then I tell him this part about the structural issue of fixing the road bed. And he goes, oh, that's interesting. I've never heard that. Like, yeah, it makes sense. Okay, I'll vote for it. And sure enough, he did. And we got the project built, and it's wonderful. And the trees are big now, and it's been very successful. So I tell you this little story because it illustrates several things we're going to talk about here. The first one is, because something is self-evidently good or bad to you does not mean it is self-evidently good or bad to other very well-meaning people. One of the 3 people who voted against this is a guy who I just think the world of, and he was a great council member and super nice guy and just everything you want in a council member. He just saw the world differently than I did. And so people will, people who again are just really good people, you like them, you always agree with them about almost everything. Some things are just going to look at the world differently. And you just have to kind of remember that, because something, to me, the self-evident goodness of that project was so obvious, that I don't see why anybody would do it. We had the funding, it was to solve all sorts of problems. People just look at things differently. Secondly, people change. The people change. The reason we had a problem with the vote was it was a new council. So the whole thing had been progressing on a previous council with different people. We have 3 new council members out of 7. So the guy who kind of taught me everything I know about certainly a lot of the world, my first boss in this business, used to have this plaque on his wall, and it said, remember, you're never talking to an audience, always to a parade. And there's always new people coming through. And you can't take for granted that the new people see this way, are going to think the same way the old people did, or that the new people are aware of the things. So just always be ready for new people and dealing with new people. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Third thing is, don't assume you always get all the information you're supposed to have. This issue of the cracked road bed was something that we didn't get in the council briefings. Public Works Director didn't seem to think it was important enough to talk about. It just was sort of a passing comment from the Public Works Director at the city next door. And it turned out to be the critical piece of information to get the vote I needed. So don't always assume that you're going to get the information you want. You got to keep looking for it and asking questions, because again, what seems self-evident as useful information to you may not be to somebody else. And finally, there's just always resistance to change. People just, and we're going to talk about this a whole bunch in this presentation, people just don't like change, particularly at the local government level. And, so Jay, who ultimately voted for this thing, just changing the road because it was ugly and dysfunctional wasn't enough for him. That was just, he didn't see any need to change that. Changing it to fix something, okay. So, the old thing, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, kind of was operative here. He didn't see it as broken until I told him it was broken, then okay, we'll fix that. But resistance to change is huge. So the way this presentation is going to go is the first half is sort of about theory. And I think because we have enough time here to sort of help you step back and see how local governments really work and why they do what they do and why you get frustrated about things. Because, it's easy to get frustrated because, stuff doesn't go the way you want it to. And so maybe some of this theory and stuff I'll talk about will help you understand why that happens. And then that'll lead into the sort of tools and frameworks to work your way around these things. So that'll be the second half after the break. First of all, and I would normally do this with all of you waving your hand, but has anybody here been directly involved in local government? Everybody served on a city council, planning commission, something like that? You want to unmute and chime in, I think you could do that. Yeah, it'd be helpful to know if I'm talking to people who really know this stuff inside and out and are going to embarrass me.
Looks like 2 people have raised their hand, yes.
Okay, so what have they done?
Would you like me to unmute somebody and let them talk?
Yeah, just real briefly. I'm just curious as to what we got here.
All right, Jennifer and Sandy, you should.
Yeah, just really quickly unmute yourselves and then tell me what you did.
Hey, this is Sandy McKenzie. I was on the University Place sub-area regional growth center subcommittee. And then I worked with them when they were trying to create their form-based code, moving to form-based code. They asked me to sit on those meetings. Great. And consult a little as a realtor.
Okay, Jennifer?
I've been serving on the Covington Planning Commission since 2013.
Oh, okay, so up at Covington, great. Okay, so a few things before we jump into this. This is what, I've been doing this presentation for, a bunch of times around the state, and mostly, sort of smaller communities. You're one of the larger ones. But what I found in a lifetime in politics at all, I've worked at the federal, state, local level, is politics scales up and down really well. I mean, the behaviors and the dynamics you see in large places really happen in small places as well. So, the material here should be applicable kind of at all levels, but, and I'll say this several times, when you're putting together a program, you want to scale it to the resources you have. The stuff we're going to talk about here and all the strategies and things that could keep a very, very large organization really busy. So you got to sort of scale the activities to the size that you have. So one thing I want to emphasize here, and this kind of start out with kind of a bummer here, but politics is really hard. I mean, that's why we're going to talk about all this stuff and how difficult it is. Politics is difficult. Mostly stuff doesn't happen. You can think of all the things in politics, all the things in the world that you think should be fixed. And they don't get fixed, and things don't happen. And that's sort of the natural state of politics, is things not happening. So, when we get around to sort of agenda setting, you want to kind of keep that in mind, is that, it's a reason to stay focused on things that you can really get done, and just recognize that an awful lot of things, inertia is just the kind of default position in politics, and things not happening. And there's the guy who kind of wrote the book about the framework I'm going to use, kind of emphasizes, that's his starting point, is mostly things don't happen. So why is it that sometimes they do? They're back since you might think of the heyday of home building, but back when it was easy, 50s, 60s, 70s. Since then, a bunch of things have changed that have made housing really difficult. And the first one was back in the 80s, you had a whole bunch of new legal frameworks put in place, environmental restrictions that grew out of big environmental programs that were put in place in the 70s. The Growth Management Act came in the latter part of the 80s. You know, all sorts of things made it much more difficult to build housing. And, you know, you couldn't just go out and, you know, buy a farm and, you know, throw down some asphalt and a few utilities and boom, build houses. You couldn't do that anymore. So, you know, that whole regulatory systems that got, particularly on the land use side, not so much on the building side, but sort of in the 80s made things really difficult. And then starting in the, you know, I don't know, 20 years ago and moving to the present, the environment for home building as a business got really difficult. And it was kind of starting in the first part of the decade, and then with the housing crash and all the regulatory stuff that happened there on financing and banking, it became really difficult and much, much harder for small builders to operate, getting financing. Chatting with a builder who runs a relatively small company, although they operate kind of at the high end, you know, telling me that just getting capital has gotten so much more difficult, even though their business has been, they've been in business for 3 generations, how much harder it is to get money. You can't just go down to your local S&L and borrow, you know, get a line of credit to go build some houses. Much more difficult. As a result of, partly as a result of that, another big change was moving into the area of the national home builders. You know, Toll Brothers and D.R. Horton and the big national publicly traded companies have moved into the area in a big way. Mostly buying local companies. So these sort of small and mid-sized builders that had a good land inventory will get snapped up by the national builders. And the problem with the national builders is that they raise their capital on national capital markets, and then they put that to work somewhere in the country where they're going to get the best return on it. So they don't have to do business here. They don't have to build houses in the Puget Sound area at all. They may own some land, but they can put their capital to work in Dallas or Phoenix or Nashville or somewhere else where they think they're going to get a better return. So all of this to say, all of these trends say you can't take home building for granted. And I think that's contrary to the mindset that exists in a lot of local governments still, where their brain is still back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, where home building was this kind of out of control force. And, you know, you had to, people would build as far as the eye could see. And remember that horrible little song about ticky-tacky boxes on the hill, you know, that was the mindset that home building was this thing that had to be reined in. I think it's kind of the opposite now. And I think home building should be treated more like you do with economic development. You know, if somebody comes into the mayor's office and says, I'm thinking of locating a factory that's going to have 300 jobs, boy, they will be all over that person, doing everything they can to get that project. I think local government should really be thinking about home building in the same way. You've got to welcome it, not fight it. And we're going to talk a whole bunch about that sort of thing. So finally, before we get started, you know, when I put this presentation together and wrote the booklet that you got, that was before the plague hit. And nobody was really sure what this whole thing was going to do with home building. And when I first started doing these presentations in the spring, we really didn't know. And I was sort of urging flexibility. Well, now that sort of the data is starting to come in, and actually home building is booming. All across, you know, figures just came out yesterday. You know, housing starts across the West are higher than they've been in, you know, a very long time for single family. And, you know, as you know, sales are booming. So, but we still really don't know how all this is going to play out, particularly in the geography. You know, there's a lot of cases being made that people are moving out of, you know, dense places into less dense places. People are moving from expensive places to affordable places because you only have to go into an office twice a week. Well, you're more willing to put up with a longer commute to do that. Plus, if everybody's doing that, then the roads are clearing up. So that longer commute now is not so time consuming. So, you know, people who are, okay, I'm working downtown Seattle. You know, I've been living in, you know, looking for a house in Bellevue, say, but hey, now I can look for a house in Maple Valley. Or if, you know, you're working in Tacoma, you could look out in Bonnie Lake or something. It's going to be, the commute's not going to be as burdensome now as it was. So that's a big force out there. And nobody knows how it's going to play out. Nobody knows at all. A lot of people speculating, but it requires a certain degree of flexibility. But I think the one thing we are starting to know is that this, you know, this thing isn't really putting a damper on, you know, the general process of people, you know, building and buying houses. You know, as it turns out, the people most negatively affected by this are, frankly, people with fairly low wage jobs who probably weren't in the home buying market anyway. They're renters. The people who are in the home buying market actually have been doing fine, and the federal government just flooding the country with money. There's just huge amounts of liquidity out there. Interest rates are low, so it's pretty good environment. So let's get going here. We're going to start out with some stuff about the structure of local government and why it is the way it is and how it came to be. The first thing you got to remember is that local governments are always creatures of state government. Okay? If you look at the U.S. Constitution, it talks about the federal government, talks about state governments. There's zero mention of local governments in the U.S. Constitution. There was a Supreme Court case back in the 19th century that said that cities are, in fact, totally under the control of state governments or local governments, cities, special districts, totally under the control of state governments. So what that means is the state will always determine what a city can do, what taxes can it levy, what regulations can it put in place, and what it can't do. Cities can only regulate certain things, only have certain authorities, and then things it must do. So when I first got on the city council of Medina, we were kind of halfway through the process of completing our shoreline plan. Any of you who've worked in cities that have waterways, that the Shoreline Management Act is a beast, and you have to put in place this whole series of regulations about how shorelines are treated, and they have to conform to what the state says. And we tried to do battle with the state on things like the width of docks and stuff like that. We got nowhere. And the state was determining, here's what you must do. Even though you got to write the plan and you got to take the heat from your constituents for it, here are the rules. So again, local government's always creatures of state government. So when you're talking to a council member or a planning director or somebody and trying to urge them to do something, don't be surprised when they say, yeah, that's a great idea, except we're not allowed to do that. We have to write this regulation this way. We can't not do that. Those standards are set at the state level. So that's kind of a really important thing to remember about local governments. A second thing is, and this is a little more abstract, but I think it's really kind of interesting. State, federal government are oriented around geography, around land. The country has these borders, and each state has a set of borders that were established 150 years ago. And so everything that happens within that boundary is the province of the state. Local governments are much more about people, and cities are formed by people. They aren't about a particular set of a particular geography. So, and I just read it just a few days ago. I was reading this really interesting book about sort of the origins of Western culture, but it talks about how in the Middle Ages, cities were formed around Europe as this sort of voluntary association. It was the emergence of voluntary associations, people getting together to do something for themselves as a group. And that's still the way cities are. They formed because people got together and decided they wanted to have a set of services, they wanted control over land use, they want these things. And so it's about creating a group of people, not necessarily an area of land that makes any sense at all. So I'm going to go to screen share here and show you a couple of things. Whoa. You have disabled screen share. Whoever's got the control.
I will make it available to all panelists. One moment.
Okay.
Is it working now?
Let's see. Oh, look at that. Yes, there we go. Okay, so you look at this this slide here. You'll see some city boundaries that I think you will find familiar. So look at Gig Harbor over there on the left. I mean, you've got that big notch down the middle. I have no idea what the story is there. A little peninsula that goes out there on the upper right-hand side. Somebody really wanted to be a Gig Harbor and their neighbors didn't. All those little notches and things. You look over at Bonnie Lake. Look at even the lake makes it interesting enough, but you've got all those little notches and bumps and bends. Again, as you see the same thing in Fife. You see the same thing in Fife. You see the same thing in Puyallup. that's because, each one of those little anomalies is a story. When back in the 90s, when there were a bunch of cities being formed, you'd see this thing where, the people trying to form the city would canvass people on the edges of where they were thinking the city would be. And if they said they didn't want to be in the city, they simply cut them out. They drew the line around their property so they wouldn't be a no vote in the incorporation process. And so and then people annex, they say, well, I want to be in the city now because I'm going to develop this property, or I just want better services, or, our neighbors are sick and tired of call 911 and no one shows up. And, we want, so that it's about people deciding they want something, as opposed to create this big, this big area like a state. And then you got to sort of negotiate within that what everybody wants. You can have this situation you have in these cities I'm showing you here, where people could be across the street from each other and have very different levels of service, different regulatory systems, and that kind of thing. Now, I know with annexation areas, it's supposed to not happen that way, but I think it does. Now, the oldest form of local government in our state are school districts. There have always been school districts, long before there were cities, and everybody's in a school district. You don't have a choice. You can have a choice to be in a city or not a city. You can't have a choice to be in a school district. But here are the school districts in Pierce County. Now, again, you see the same sort of thing. Look at those sort of notches. Look at the Orting School District. It notches around the White River School District and the Sumner School District. You've got a little tiny University Place School District, the Steilacoom Historical School District. By the way, Steilacoom is the oldest city in the state. Did you know that? 1854. So you've got in Fife, and you actually in Pierce County have 2 school districts that don't have high schools. So people in those areas decided, hey, we like the idea of having our local school district for K-8, and we're fine with that. Kids go to high school somewhere else. That's the Derringer and Carbonado districts don't have high schools. So again, it's this thing of choice. People can just kind of join the group they want to join. So again, a long way of saying cities are about people joining, people working together, as opposed to sort of existing in this big area where they all gotta bump into each other and get along. This comes into play a lot in some of the stuff we'll be talking about later. So back to the show here. So some things about the structure of local government. Now, you're all pretty familiar with this, so I don't need to go into a whole bunch. And if you're not as familiar, the booklet that you get has a bunch of stuff about the way local governments are structured, on the way we create cities and what different cities look like. But there's a few things to emphasize. One is the role of counties. Counties are this really schizophrenic entities. The counties are subdivisions of the state, so that's their first and foremost role. So if you want to do business, you're doing business with the state, but you can't go to Olympia, so you go to your county. So counties run the whole criminal justice system. If you are unfortunate enough to get arrested for a felony, that's the state's problem, but the whole process will take place at the county level. If the election system, there are elections coming up here, all run by the county. It's a state function run by the county. Property assessments, the state function run by the county. So counties do the business of the state. If you look at a map of states on the East Coast in particular, you see they have zillions of little tiny counties. And that's because the rule was that in the old days, you had to be able to ride to the county seat on your horse and back in one day to do your business. So can't do that anymore. I don't think anybody's going to ride to the county seat of Lincoln County and back on their horse in one day, but that's the first role of counties. The second role of counties is doing things that make sense to do from a regional perspective that aren't required. So a lot of transit services are run by counties. Sewage treatment services are run by counties. These things that need to be done on a broad level, multi-city, aren't required to be done by county, but are. The third thing that counties are, of course, is the government for the unincorporated areas, the local governments. So the county sheriff is your police department. The county building department is your building department. Now, counties don't do everything. Counties don't run fire departments anywhere. They don't run water and sewer utilities, the stuff that hooks to your house. They don't run those. So there's special districts to run those, but counties run the other stuff. So, in Pierce County, you're about almost half of the people live in unincorporated Pierce County. It's about 45%. So, that's a big role for county government. So when you're dealing with the county, you always kind of got to know which county, which head am I dealing with here? Which brain are they operating on right now? Are they operating on the regional brain, the state brain, or the local brain? And it makes them kind of weird that way. Particularly makes their budgeting weird. some horrible budgeting presentations where they mix everything up. Secondly, there's just a lot of overlap and diffusion of responsibilities. That school district map has existed for a long time. Cities come in later. So cities can overlap school districts. You have school districts that operate in multiple cities. You can have cities that have multiple school districts in them. I don't know how that happens down in Pierce County. In King County, the city of Sammamish, you're in the Lake Washington district on the north end, and you're in the Issaquah school district on the south end. Even in Bellevue has the Bellevue school district, but the Issaquah school district serves the southern part of Bellevue. So a big trend in the last couple of decades has been the consolidation of fire departments. So every city used to have a little fire department, you had rural fire districts. Now they're all consolidating into these big fire districts to serve cities and unincorporated areas, which is great. But again, you have a fire district, which is a separate government operating across jurisdictions, and it may have different views of things. You still have water and sewer districts that operate within cities, and they may have different views of things. So we're talking about growth and change and how things are going to move forward. It's not just the city you have to worry about. Some of the local governments that are overlapping within those areas will have a say. I mean, fire departments determine road standards for emergency vehicles, ingress and egress and those sorts of things. That's a big deal if you're developing property. Water and sewer districts determine whether you're going to get hookups and what the cost of those hookups are going to be. So again, a lot of responsibility overlap between special districts and cities that are out there. It is not rational in the slightest. It works generally. I mean, a lot of places when they incorporated a whole bunch of incorporations back in the 90s, and a lot of those cities left their fire districts and water and sewer districts in place. Those are complicated services they didn't want to deal with as they're trying to get a city up and running. So there's plenty of that going on, and it generally works okay, except when you get conflicts. I remember talking to a developer who was just wrestling with a fire district. Everything was fine with the city. The fire department was being a problem. So those are some things about the structure that I think are worth keeping in mind. And there's a bunch of other things in the booklet there. So how do local governments, specifically get involved with housing? First of all, as we all know, land use is the jealously guarded prerogative of local governments. It's why local governments exist for the most part. Certainly the newer ones. All the corporations, there were 10 of them in King County in the 90s. There were several in Pierce County, a bunch in Snohomish County. All had to do with the Growth Management Act came in. And so there's all this planning is supposed to happen. All this land use action is going to happen, and people want control of that. They form cities to do that. So and I learned this very clearly on my time in the city council is you can mess with a lot of things. Don't try to mess with land use. That is a very, very closely guarded, and we'll talk about some of the implications of that. So there's a bunch of stuff here, and you know this because you live with it, but I want to emphasize a couple of things that you'll run into. One is the argument that because local government provides the services to new housing. So new houses built. Kids go to the local school, people visit the local park, there has to be fire protection and police protection and the library, all these things that local governments do to serve that house. There's an argument that floats around out there that new housing does not pay for itself, that it doesn't generate enough income to support those services, that therefore, we need higher impact fees or just, don't do the development or something because we can't afford it. I think that's nonsense. It has been demonstrated several places. And it's just not an argument that holds up, for several reasons. First of all, the really expensive stuff is fire service. Building a new fire station is and staffing is a hugely expensive thing to do. But under growth management, you're operating more on an infill basis. So the existing fire stations actually generally can serve a lot more homes than they do now. It's about response time. It's not about, how far the thing is. And so if you're doing infill, fire service, same with police service. There's not a lot of crime in your brand new neighborhoods. The police department can serve that area. So this, and then, new houses throw off a lot of tax revenue. I mean, there's sales tax on the entire construction project, development project, all that's sales taxable. They're paying property tax, and because the new houses tend to be worth more, they're coming on the rolls at a higher level. And then all the people who live there are spending in the local economy, generating sales tax. So all those things are throwing off a lot of tax revenue. The idea that it's only commercial stuff that brings in the tax revenue, I think is nonsense. Don't let anybody tell you that stuff, okay? It just doesn't make sense. A second thing that happens with local governments, and I've seen this for years, when you start talking about housing affordability, or if you use the actual term affordable housing, the brains of people in local government immediately shift over to something that's got a subsidy in it. Whether that's built by a nonprofit, it's built by a housing authority, it's an inclusionary thing that's got a cross subsidy within the project, something that's got a subsidy in it. Okay, and how many conversations I've been in where I say, well, you've got a housing affordability problem in your community, and they say, oh, but we gave money to such and such a nonprofit. That's sort of wash our hands. No, that's not it. Not subsidized housing is, in the low single digits in terms of the amount of housing in the community. It isn't a solution. It's a solution to some individual's problem who are lucky enough to get those units. But in terms of the size of the problem, subsidized housing is just not going to come not even close. It's orders of magnitude off. We have affordable housing shortages in the tens of thousands, and we build units in the dozens, subsidized units. So as a general rule, if something requires a subsidy, it doesn't scale to the problem we have. You just kind of keep that in mind. If somebody starts talking about, oh, we're going to solve our problems with subsidies, the scale just isn't there. The dilemma is, and it's sort of a conceptual idea to think about, is there's two kinds of affordability problems. There's cost problems and income problems. Income problems are where people just don't know. Housing could be as affordable as you could possibly be, but if people don't have income, they just don't have income because of disabilities, or there's just a whole bunch of problems in their life. They're never going to work. They have an income problem. They're never going to have income. They need a subsidy. Okay. Cost problems have to do with, obviously, the stuff is too expensive because it's too expensive to build. And there's a whole giant literature in urban economics about why housing is expensive to build. But it's well documented. Those are cost problems. And the worst thing you could do in situations like this is what's referred to as you subsidize the demand side and burden the cost side. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So anyway, a couple of things just to kind of keep in mind about local governments and the sorts of things you'll hear from them. So does anybody have questions at this point? Want to chime in on? I can see the chat if you want to type a question in there or get a hold of the moderator. If anybody has any questions, if anything I've been saying here doesn't make sense, now's the time. Are you all awake? I can't see you.
We'll give people a moment to type a question in the chat if they have.
Or you could raise your hand and I'll allow you to be able to speak.
Okay.
All right.
Well explained, no questions. Thank you. Now I'll see if I can totally confuse you in the next part. So we're going to get into some of the theoretical stuff about housing and housing politics. There is a particular politics around housing, as you know, and it's different from other politics, so we'll talk about this. So I'm going to start out with three of my favorite theories that I think will make sense to you. So the first one is called the Tebow hypothesis. And I used to have to explain it had nothing to do with the guy who was the quarterback, but that's a long time ago. I don't think anybody remembers Tim Tebow anymore, and it's spelled differently. So Tebow was an economist back in the 50s, and he wanted to know why it was that you could go to different cities and places and spending and services would be quite different in a big metropolitan area. So, you could go to Pierce County and you could go to University Place and you'd find, the taxes and the services and everything are very different from Lakewood or very different from Tacoma. They're right next to each other. Why is that? So he did a bunch of research and he came to the conclusion that in a metropolitan area with lots of different cities like Pierce County and like King County, people have choices of where to live and they self-select into the city that meets their needs, that they recognize as meeting their particular needs. Now, when this work was done back in the 50s, school districts were locally funded. So today, that we send our money to the state sends it back to the school district. Back then, you sent your money directly to the school district. So you could have very different tax rates in different school districts, depending on how fancy they wanted their school. So you could have a school district in one place that was sort of bare bones, no fancy equipment, maybe some heat for the kids, but taxes were really low. Right next door, you could have a school district where everything's gold plated. And, football teams got brand new uniforms every year, and, they're taking field trips all over the place. You have totally different things. And that doesn't happen anymore, but other things do. I mean, you could have very different. I did some work not long ago on police service, and, there are cities, adjacent cities up in King County that have half the police coverage of the city next door, the officers per household or something like that. So you're making these choices. And what happens is people move into a place because it exhibits the qualities they want. And then they elect city council members and planning commissioners and other people who will keep it that way, the way it was when they moved in. Very important. And his point was, if you're in a place and you don't like it, for whatever reason you're there and you decide you don't like it, what people do is they leave. They vote with their feet, as they say, rather than try to change it. And having tried, I love change. I love changing things. And boy, on my city council, that was not popular. So, we've been doing things a certain way. And, again, we're a bit like my example before. We're right next to the city of Clyde Hill, almost exactly the same size, very similar cities. They just have really different stuff than we do. And so people will choose one city or another depending on what they want, and they will leave if they don't like it. And so that's a really important idea here when you're talking about sort of promoting change, is that people like the place the way it was when they moved in. And they're doing a lot of stuff to try to keep it that way. So that's Tebow, number one. Number two is the nature of politics. And right now, of course, we are absolutely immersed in partisan politics at the national level. You just can't, you can't turn around without seeing stuff about that. Republicans, Democrats, liberal, conservative, and all that stuff. Those dichotomies or frameworks make very little sense at the local level, okay? And because the issues are completely different. And I'm sure of people who are, maybe they're both ardent Republicans who will find themselves on opposite sides of a local issue, or ardent Democrats are on opposite sides of things. Or you'll find people who, an ardent Democrat and an ardent Republican working together on something, because the politics shake out differently at the local level. So as a sociologist at Temple University some years ago, came up with a different continuum. So you have the liberal conservative continuum. He came up with a different one. He called it cosmopolitan local. And it made a lot of sense to me, because at the cosmopolitan end are people who benefit from growth and change. Okay? They, when the community is growing, they personally benefit from that. Realtors are almost always out there on the cosmopolitan end, because obviously, you benefit from more houses being built and more people moving into the community. That's what you do. Local businesses, if you're running a restaurant or a store or something, yeah, you want change, you want growth, you want more people, more customers. If you're, in a big city, you're looking at sort of the development of the entire city. You're looking at things like, building facilities and building parks and amenities that are going to bring people in. At the opposite end, the local end, are people who really support things that they will use, that they will personally benefit from. But if they don't directly benefit from something, they're not going to support that. A classic example of this, I spent some time working on the campaign for what's now CenturyLink Field. And, a football stadium, an NFL football stadium, is a classic example of this continuum. If you like football, yeah, you'll support the stadium. If you don't like football, no, that's just not something the public should be doing. If you're a local, if you're a cosmopolitan, you may hate football, but you recognize that NFL football is this great visibility for your city and national media. You got all those skyboxes for business people to go into. There's all these benefits, even if you don't like football. So that's the cosmopolitan local continuum, and it makes a whole lot more sense than liberal conservative. So when you're dealing with people and you're kind of trying to scout out the political landscape, the NIMBYs are the people kind of on that local level. And again, they may be very liberal people in their national politics. They may be very conservative people in national politics, but their local politics are different. A third one, and this one is going to be a little more complicated. It has to do with something in the field of behavioral economics. And some of you may have stumbled across a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is about behavioral economics. And it's about the way that people's behaviors influence economic choices they make. And one of the things these guys came up with was the idea, and they call it loss aversion. And that is the idea that people place a lot more value on losing something than on gaining something. So easy example, if someone came up to you and said, hey, I'll bet you $100 on a coin flip, chances are very low that you would accept that bet. Even though you're 50-50 chance, you could win $100, you could lose $100, but the prospect of losing the $100 looms much larger in your life than the prospect of winning it. So if it was maybe 70-30, you might take it, you know, but people tend to place much more emphasis on loss than on gains. And this plays out in politics in a big way. So I'm going to go back to screen share. I'm going to show you this. There we go. Whoa. Okay. So this diagram I'm going to show you is based on a framework that was taught to me by a guy named Bob Gogarty, who was the guru of politics in Seattle for a long time. He ran the football stadium campaign, he ran the Sound Transit campaign, lots of stuff. And he taught me this framework. And we'll get back to this loss aversion thing in here. So he said, when you want to get something done in politics, and you look out there at the political landscape, you divide everybody up into these 5 groups. Okay. You've got your little windows on the right side. If you can move those over, you might want to. So you got 5 groups, and this could be an item that is in front of a legislative body or something that's going to be voted on. It can work either way. So first of all, you have the hard opposition. These are people who are philosophically opposed to whatever it is. They just, you know, their deep-seated views are opposed to it. So football stadium, they just think that there's no, you know, the public should never build football stadiums or sports facilities, just never, ever. Totally opposed to something, okay? The second group, the soft opposition, these are people who are opposed, but for a reason that is logical. It may not be true, but it's logical. So in the case of the football stadium, the people who fell into this camp were people who didn't want to pay taxes for it. Pretty logical. You know, nobody likes paying taxes, and people didn't think it was appropriate to pay taxes. They didn't care about football stadiums. They didn't care if the public owned it. They just didn't want to pay for it. And it turned out that they weren't. There were no general taxes in it, and we were able to deal with that. But I worked on a development project with a developer up in North Seattle some years ago, and you know, my job was to deal with the angry neighbors. We needed to rezone, and you know, there was a bunch of neighbors who didn't want the thing to happen. And what I found was there was a big group of people who were simply concerned about traffic and parking, like everybody else in neighborhoods. You know, they weren't philosophically opposed to the project. In fact, some of them kind of liked it. They had a big problem with cut-through traffic in this little neighborhood, and they didn't want more traffic. And so that was okay. That's logical. I can deal with that. You know, we came up with a way to deal with that. So soft opposition is there because of a logical reason. Okay. Neutral is just neutral, and you know, sometimes we like to think that people who are neutral are really much more thoughtful, and they're weighing the pros and cons. Mostly, they're just actually poorly informed and not paying much attention. But neutral is neutral. Soft support. These are the people who you know, generally think something's a good idea. They're not going to go to the mat on it. If it doesn't happen, they're not going to lose sleep over it. But they'll benefit from this in some way. They look at it as really a cost-benefit analysis, and they say, okay, there's some costs, there's some benefits, but on balance, okay, I will benefit from this thing. Yeah, I'll pay some taxes maybe for this, you know, this facility, but my business will do a little bit better because people are coming to that. So, okay, I can support that. The hard support, of course, are the people who, you know, the diehard fans of whatever it is, the people who are actually personally, you know, financially benefiting from something, or, you know, in the case of, again, the football stadium, these are the people, we found them in sports bars all over the state, you know, the big football fans. They are absolutely in this thing. So, so you have these people, And these are we just kind of walk through. This is where they are. Now, what do you do with this when you've created this? This is where we're going to get to the point I was making earlier. So the first group, these are not persuadable. Don't waste your time with these people. You know these people. You know lots of them. They're the people who show up at city council meetings and say things that you don't agree with. You know, you probably know them. Maybe you like them. Maybe they're friends of yours, but don't think you're ever going to persuade them on things at all. You're not. So, you know, be courteous, be nice, be friendly, but don't waste your time with them. The soft opposition, this is where the action is. So we're going to come back. This is where it comes back to the point of loss aversion. These are people who feel they're going to lose something, okay? And no matter how much you can try to convince them they might gain something, their cost-benefit analysis comes out on the end of their feel they're losing something. You have to take away that reason they feel they're going to lose something. This was Bob Gogarty's big lesson to me, was you cannot persuade someone to support something if they feel they're going to lose something. And so, you know, in the case of this development project in North Seattle, I had to take away their reason for, you know, thinking that there were going to be parking problems. And we were able to do that. We came up with a plan to do some parking or traffic improvements in the little neighborhood, and it works great. And it worked. Their opposition disappeared. Okay. Football stadium, we convinced people, no, there were no general taxes in this. So you take away their reason for being opposed, then you can make them supporters if you need to. Okay? But you have moved them into the neutral camp at that point. Take away the reason for opposing, they're now neutral. Now, if this is something going before voters, you have to turn them into supporters. If it's something going at a legislative body, you're probably done. You know, they're not going to oppose you, then that's all you really need to worry about. Neutral people can be moved to support with persuasion. So when we got through convincing people they weren't going to pay any taxes for a football stadium, then we had these great ads with, you know, families, you know, people playing touch football in the backyard and playing soccer and all the wonderful things that sports brings to a community. I got to be the football dad. It was really fun in the ad. You may remember that. My son played soccer. So you can do that, but you can't do that with the people who are in the soft opposition. That's where that loss aversion thing comes in. So soft opposition, loss aversion, get them out of there. Soft support, we're going to talk a bunch more about these people. They can be moved to hard support with facts sometimes. Sometimes you just need to remember they're there and cultivate them. So the action is in those two areas when you're dealing with things at a legislative level. If you're dealing with elections, that's a different matter, that you have to deal with the neutrals. But turn your soft opposition into at least neutral. And again, deal with that idea they feel they're going to lose something. With the soft support, these are your coalition members and that we're going to talk about in a little bit. So hope that made sense. Any questions on that? This diagram isn't in the booklet. It's one I didn't put in there for a bunch of reasons. Feel free to copy down the stuff there, but you won't find that in the booklet. Okay, so.
Mike, we do have one question. I'm not
Great.
sure if this is the right time to bring this up. In your
Absolutely, go
opinion,
ahead.
in your opinion, what effects are state and local budget deficits going to have on housing in the near future, such as 2 to 3 years?
It really depends on how they try to balance those budgets. It shouldn't have a lot, except in that you get things like, you know, are they going to cut staffing in their planning department? You know, permits are going to take longer to process. That would be sort of the big thing you're gonna see. I would think that you would, you know, it could have a positive effect, saying, well, more housing is, you know, improving the tax base. But again, I go back to that argument that you know, a lot of people don't believe that more housing will improve your tax, you know, be a net improvement in your tax base. I think some issues with local services. You know, if you start cutting police service, particularly, that could, you know, make a community somewhat less attractive. But that plays out over time. It doesn't really play out in the short term. So I can't see a lot of huge things. It's just going to take up mind share. Is the other thing. You know, having been in a city council, when you have budget problems, it sort of sucks the oxygen out of the room. And if people are coming in wanting to do some positive things, you know, boy, it's hard to get the council's attention. So those things that come up. If I have other thoughts, maybe during the break, I'll chime in. Any other questions? Okay. So we're now going to move on to some stuff about the politics of housing that's kind of the real bummers here, but we got to wrestle with them. This is why housing politics, they got sort of 5 points here, why housing politics is really difficult. This is stuff I came up with a long time ago, and I was sort of really frustrated, and I said, why is it that it's so hard to get things done with housing? And I came up with these ideas. The first one is that housing is a regional need, regional housing markets, but the solutions are all local. So, you know, there's a, you know your markets. I mean, there's sort of a Pierce County market, there's Puget Sound markets. We have somebody here from Covington, so you're operating in South King County. So there's these big markets that stretch over long periods within commute sheds where people commute to and from, where they feel an acceptable commute. That's the need, but that need is satisfied on a city-by-city basis, okay? Theoretically, under the Growth Management Act, the city-by-city zoning and capacity is supposed to add up to the regional need, and it never does, and you know that. Because cities monkey with things. They have phantom capacity, and they can get away with that. So you have enough phantom capacity in things that, you know, areas that are simply never going to get built, densities that are never going to be able to be achieved. You know, the Growth Management Act allows for that. You know, you could decide that, you know, the city of Fife is going to meet all of its, you know, capacity needs with, you know, 2 high rises. I mean, you can't build high rises there with runways. Anyway, you can do stuff like that and get away with it. And so the local stuff doesn't add up to the regional need. That's point number 1. Secondly, housing is a public need. Okay, it's one of those really basics. You know, food, clothing, and shelter. Everybody needs this. It's a public need, but it's provided almost entirely by the private sector. A little bit provided by the public sector. So we got a bunch of examples of this that are out there. Food, you know, food is an obvious public need. And we have massive federal programs to make sure that we all have enough food. The Department of Agriculture, you know, spends huge amounts of money on price supports and you know, buying surpluses and all that stuff to make sure that farmers can just keep producing lots of food. And we have programs to make sure the food is safe and it's distributed and people don't have enough to eat, get SNAP cards, and we just have all this stuff to make sure people get enough to eat. Energy, you know, we have all of this effort to make sure that there's enough oil and gas and electricity to meet our needs, all mostly done by the federal government, but also state requirements as well. So we have examples where a public need is met by a lot of public action on the supply side. Housing, that doesn't happen. In fact, it's the opposite. We inhibit the supply. We don't promote the supply. So we promote demand. As we talked about earlier, you know, we have federal mortgage programs, Fannie and Freddie, and mortgage interest deductions and these things on the demand side, but we have nothing at all on the supply side that, you know, encourages development of the supply of housing in the same way we encourage the, you know, development of the supply of corn or gasoline. And this, you end up in this classic economic dilemma I mentioned before, which is where you're restricting supply and subsidizing demand, which is just a terrible thing to do. You subsidize demand through mortgage programs, you restrict supply through local regulation, and all that does is make certain people richer because they control the supply. Terrible idea, but that's what we're stuck with. And again, that makes housing policy difficult because there's no sort of global effort on the supply. Third point, it's easier to stop things than to start things for local governments or for any governments. So the Growth Management Act said we will not have urban sprawl. We're going to have urban growth lines and there will be no development outside. That's easy. That's just drawing a line on a map. Anybody can do that. Creating the alternatives within the urban growth line, higher density housing, development in areas that wouldn't otherwise develop, different kinds of products and stuff, that's really, really hard. And cities just don't know how to do that. I mean, you've probably seen you know, efforts that are, you just look at at a plan and you say, it's ridiculous, no one's ever going to do that. You know, my favorite was the city of SeaTac. You know, you've all been to the airport, so the area, the International Boulevard, that's opposite the airport there, adjacent to the airport. The original comp plan for SeaTac had that lined with multifamily housing, and that was their plan. That was the alternative, you know, that was going to get the capacity we needed, which was preposterous. So local governments are really bad at starting things. Sometimes they get it right. but mostly that's just much, much harder than stopping things. Fourth point, what's the constituency for housing? Okay. Anytime doing a political action, you know, what you try to do is build up your constituent, find the people who are going to benefit from this, who want this thing to happen. What is the constituency that wants housing to happen? Well, mostly it's the people, you know, you'd think, well, it's logical, people are going to live in it, right? But how do you find those people? You can't, because an action today results in housing 5 or 10 years from now. So if you get a land use policy right today, you know, it's going to take time for, okay, then that land gets sold to a developer, and then it gets, you know, subdivided, and then some houses get built, and you're 5 to 10 years out before the policy decision you fought for today bear fruit. So you can't find today the people that come advocate for you who are going to live in the house that gets built. You don't know who they are. They're still in high school, or they're living in Cleveland right now, or something like that. So finding the obvious constituency is extremely difficult. You can find other constituencies, and we'll talk about that, but that's just really, really hard. So there's, you know, realtors and builders, that's great, but, you know, local businesses who are going to develop, you know, benefit from more customers. But yeah, you're all self-interested. So how do you find constituencies who are not sort of viewed as self-interested in that way? Finally, housing has, to the extent it's supportable by people who aren't going to live in it, the benefits of housing are very generalized. They're, you know, a more vibrant community, more kids in the schools, more, you know, people in the community, more people spending money at local businesses, all those good things that happen, but they're generalized. The impacts are very specific. The house is built on a certain piece of land that somebody has seen as vacant for years, and they really don't like that. So, you know, you can have somebody who generally supports housing. They're, you know, never been a problem. They think it's all good. They tell you that at the Rotary Club meeting. But then when they see that sign going up across the street in that pasture across from their house that, you know, has been there forever, and their kids play in there, and they run their dog in there and throw their grass clippings there, and they see deer in the morning and all this, and they see it's going to be turned into housing, they go ballistic. It's a very localized impact, even though they can maybe see those general benefits. That's where that loss aversion idea comes in. Those local, you know, what people will perceive as negatives are very concentrated, whereas the benefits are very diffuse. So those are some reasons that housing politics is very difficult. We're going to talk next after the break about how you sort of get your arms around those and try to make things happen. So before we go to the break, you have a homework assignment. I want you all to do this. Come up with some issues facing your community, and whatever community that is you're in, around housing that your association and your you know, local community, maybe you're active with your chamber or something, that you're wrestling with around housing. Come up with some of those, and I'm going to get those from you after we come back from the break. So now we go to a break for about 10 minutes. And if you have other questions, please chime in with those as well. You know, the mayor wants to get something done, but they need some help from the private sector. Are you the one that they're calling to say, hey, I need your help on this? And you provide that help, you are then building relationships that are the best kind. Okay? If your relationship is only about you asking for things, that's a pretty weak relationship. One of the things that's very important right now and bad that's happening around the city of Seattle is all the people surrounding the mayor and the council are all people who want things. The mayor and the council don't have anybody around them who wants to help them do things. It's all people who got their hand out. It doesn't work that way. So build relationships around being helpful, being supportive politically. You know, are you the person that's helping run the school levy campaign? You know, somebody needs to run those things and go out and get the votes for the school levies because you need school levies. Are you doing those things? That's how you build relationships. So keep that in mind. What can I do to be helpful? Not just what do I want out of a relationship. It's like any other relationship in life. You put things in, you get things out. Information. So I ran across a wonderful phrase at one point, and it says that it's easy to forget what it's like not to know the things you know. So you all as professionals in an industry have industry knowledge. You know how houses are bought and sold. You know how real estate is developed. You know how markets work. You know the relationship between job growth and who's going to move in. You know all that stuff. It's instinctive to you. Most people don't know that stuff at all. They have and it's easy to forget that the people around you don't know those things. Okay, so you have specialized information, and you need to get that information into the political system. And even people who should know those things, you know, people in planning departments quite often don't. They may know general things. They don't necessarily know what's happening in markets today. So it's really important that you are always providing information that is unique to your industry, unique knowledge that you have that other people don't have. Communication is an art and not a science. Same guy who talked about the parade also used to say that frequently when the staff would completely mess up on something. He would remind us, yes, communication is an art and not a science. So always be figuring out different ways to communicate the information to different people, different ways to present information, because that's your role, is to move that information in. And again, always remember, most people don't know the stuff that you know, and they need to know it. It's important that the information you have be part of processes. So that's item number 2 is information. So relationships and information, those are the 2 things you have. Now, we'll get on to the strategic model here. This came from a guy I got this from a political scientist named John Kingdon, who was at the University of Michigan. And he wondered why it was, as I mentioned earlier, mostly in politics, things don't happen, okay? If you go back, if you look at what's happening at a state or federal level, you will find armies of advocates out there telling you about, there's 15, 25, 30 crises at any given moment. And it's a crisis in this crisis, and mostly nothing happens to actually deal with those. So he wanted to know why sometimes things do happen, and what are the ingredients that you need to make sure that something does happen. And what he came up with was 3 different pieces of this process. The first one is the description of the problem to be solved, or the opportunity to be captured. So this is where I was looking for examples, because it's the sort of the big problem in describing problems, I guess, is the confusion between conditions and problems. Okay, they're very different things. A condition is the observed reality that you see. Okay, traffic jams are a condition. They're not a problem. They're a condition. You see cars all stopped. Now you can then say, well, what's the problems that create those conditions? The problems are things that are discrete and, most importantly, that have a solution associated with them. You can solve them. Conditions are, by definition, things you can't solve. You can ameliorate them. If a person is poor, that's a condition. Poverty is a condition. You can give them money, and you've ameliorated the condition. You haven't dealt with the reason that person is poor, but you've ameliorated. So conditions can be ameliorated. They can be mitigated. They can't be solved. Problems are something you solve. So to go back to the example, traffic is a condition. a poorly designed interchange that has traffic backing up into the lanes of the main line, that's a problem. Okay, that's something that could be solved by redesigning the interchange. You know, build a queuing lane off to the side. So you can do something, and that will, you know, improve the flow of traffic by solving that discrete problem. So when the first stage in anything you're doing is describing the problem, you have to make sure you describe a problem and not just a condition. So to go to housing, you know, housing is expensive. Well, that's a condition. That's not a problem, okay? So to say we need to solve housing affordability, you don't solve housing affordability. You can mitigate it, you can subsidize it, no, but that doesn't solve the problem. That just sort of mitigates the condition that you have. So describing the problem is the first thing. And, you know, if you have some mention about centers and corridors and transit. So, you know, transit is that is a problem. If there's a lack of transit service, that's a problem that can be solved. You can add transit service. Now, it may not be easy. You may not be able to do it, but you can describe a solution to that and describe that as a problem to be solved. Okay. So that's the first thing, is describing the thing. And it's when you start to think about it and dissect it, it's way, way harder than you think. And you need to spend a lot of time, because if you can't describe the problem in a way that people can say, okay, yeah, that's solvable, they're not going to get anywhere. People just say, yeah, that's just something you learn to live with it. It's a condition, now you learn to live with it. I'm afraid in a lot of ways that's where we are with housing affordability. It's just kind of this condition. We have to learn to live with it. No, we don't. But until you describe it as something that is solvable, you won't get very far. The second piece of Kingdom's model, describe the issues, is the solutions themselves. You have to have things that you can do to solve this problem that you've described. Again, the problem, a problem definition has the notion of a solution, then you have to actually come up with the solution. So solutions have to be specific. They have to be something that can be done. Again, you might not be able to get there, but it has to be, feasible. So, if there's inadequate transit service to an area that you're thinking of adding a lot of density to, okay, what kind of transit service do you need? Do you need an all-day route to that place? Do you need a rush hour route to that place? What kind of service do you need to have there? The obvious thing about housing affordability is land availability. So if you think there isn't enough land available, and so where would you make land available? If you think you can move an urban growth line, which I know is a daunting prospect, but it's theoretically doable, where would you move it? You got to be able to draw lines on maps, and you got to be able to describe the solutions to things. You can't punt those, okay? One of the things that happens a lot, I find, is people, if they get to the point of describing the problem, then they say, well, they say, okay, you city government, or you guys, you come up with the solution, tell us what it's going to be. You can't do that. You've got to be the ones coming up with solutions. And the problem is that those solutions are often very technical in nature. You personally may not have the expertise to do it. You got to go out and find the expertise. So you have friends who are and work for engineering firms and planning firms and law firms, and people who have the technical expertise to define the solution, and say, hey, here's where we draw the line on the map, or yeah, you could run a sewer line out here. Look, this is a place you could do that. You've got to be able to do that and be specific about it, because if you just sort of say, hey, you local government, you public works department, or you planning department, you come up with a solution to this thing, they're going to come up with a solution they want, not the solution that you want. And your solution probably isn't going to be the one that's ultimately adopted, but you got to go in with something. You got to go into the negotiating process with something very specific. So come up with solutions that are feasible and technically correct. You don't want to go in there, with your solution and they say, yeah, well, that's illegal, or that's, you're running a sewer line uphill. You're not going to do that. So that's where you have to get the technical stuff. The third piece of Kingdom's model had to do with the political side. So you can have the greatest, a really well-defined problem, and you can have a solution that really makes a lot of sense. You have to get to a point where the people who are going to vote on this feel it is in their personal interest to vote on it. Okay? So their political interest, and that they believe that it's a good thing, and it's not going to injure their political career or whatever, that vote they're going to take as a good thing for them to do. And you got to get to that point. And I'm sure you can think of lots of examples where you can't get to that point. Everything sort of all your ducks lined up on your proper solution, your plan, and everything else. Get to the council members and they say, nah, I can't do that. So working the political side to make sure, and this goes back to you're creating that atmosphere positive for housing. If you've done that well, and you've created this generally positive atmosphere for housing, then you're more likely to create the political atmosphere where you can get the votes you need on the council or the commission if you're working with one. Now, Kingdon's point in this was when he sort of came up with these 3 buckets of stuff: problems, solutions, and politics. That's not particularly innovative. You probably could have come up with that yourself. The big aha for him was that these things are all happening at the same time. This is not a sequential process. So it's not like you say, okay, let's go define this problem. Then, okay, now we'll go come up with a solution. Then we'll take the solution into the political arena and we'll get it done. No, it's not sequential like that. These things are happening at the same time. Now, he was operating at the federal level where these things are bubbling around all the time, but to some extent he can happen at the state level or at the local level. People who are working on solutions to problems that have not yet been identified or well-defined, okay? That there are people who are trying to make political cases for things that haven't been well-defined yet. You got to be doing all 3. So that's where you're creating that political atmosphere, even though you might not have an agenda item yet. You're thinking about it. You may see, an opportunity out there for a development project that no one else has seen yet. That's sort of the solution. You be thinking about that. Be developing that. You're defining issues where nobody really knows what to do about them yet, but you got to be out there defining them. The other thing that came out was that these things are happening with different people. So it's not one great big group moving through a process. It's independent actors. Now, this is not something that necessarily totally scales down to the local level, but think about it that way, because the problem is that political windows are narrow. And if you haven't, if you don't have your solutions sort of lined up before people even start talking about the problem, you just don't have time. The political window, when you have the people who are excited about something and willing to take it on, they're not going to wait 6 months for you to come up with the thing you need to come up with. So you need to be working on these things all the time. And that's the case to be made, as we'll get to it in a little bit, for a fairly narrow agenda where you can be doing all those things at once. So that's the sort of framework, and in this we'll talk about how do you put that into some specific activities. But create that atmosphere, work at the regulatory level, be ready to work at the legislative level, city councils and commissions when that time comes. You've built relationships, you have quality information, and there's some pages in the booklet about building quality information that I would urge you to have a look at. Information is it doesn't have to be elaborate. That's the thing. You have to write 25 pages. Nobody's going to read 25 pages. And I think I put it in the book. I can't remember. A notion I used to work with where you have 3 audiences. You have the 30-second audience, the 5-minute audience, and the I got to read it because it's my job audience. And you're working on the 30-second and the 5-minute audience. Don't worry about things that take more than 5 minutes to read. So work on your information, develop those relationships, and make sure those relationships are consistently renewed. And then, when you get down to it, you're dealing with definitions, solutions, framework. So the thing before we get to the specific activities, this idea of coalition building. So think back to the diagram with the green boxes and the opposite, soft support, hard support. The place you're going to, and I mentioned earlier, what's the constituency for housing? How do you find the constituency for what you want to do? You're finding in the light green box, okay? The soft support. So these are people and organizations that see housing as valuable, but it's really not their thing, okay? I spent 10 years at a Chamber of Commerce. By the way, we have just are in the middle of a thunderstorm and my thing just flickered. If I go dead, you'll know why. Yeah, it's raging out there. If I lose power, you'll know why. So those green boxes, that's where you find. So again, I worked at Chamber of Commerce for 10 years, and housing was never really our issue. We're doing the stuff that chambers always do, which is transportation and education and tax policy and regulatory stuff. It could be our issue. We could be brought along, but you need to be cultivated. So a lot of nonprofits, human service organizations, housing is important to them because their clients need housing, but it's not the front thing that they do. So you need to be cultivating those people a lot. And I'll talk in a second about that. But always remember, it's not just you guys and your friends in the builder, among the build, maybe some local businesses that benefit from this, the plumbing supply place or whatever else. It's a broader coalition that you need to be building as you go through this. So let's move on to the specific things that you're going to do. I've got all this theory. We've worked it down into kind of a framework. Now, what are you going to do? So there's a lot of things, and there's a whole list of them in the end of the booklet. But there's 3 things that I think are non-negotiable. These are things you have to do at whatever scale you're operating at. The first one is build your agenda, a specific agenda. And in doing that, you're going to get yourself some focus, and you're going to be able to communicate to everybody what you stand for. You may do this to some extent. Really focus on this. And it doesn't have, and there's some stuff in the booklet about this. It doesn't have to be a super long document. It doesn't have to be really elaborate. Don't worry about the graphics and pictures and all that stuff. It doesn't. As long as it's professionally, presented. So you want it well written and proper spelling and all that sort of thing. You don't have to worry about the graphic stuff too much. You want to pick your issues based on a lot of things. A little diagram I'll show you in a second, but one that sort of occurred to me as I was going back over my notes this morning is that you want to think of things that are new that no one else has thought of. There's a sort of process of diminishing returns around political issues. If you're not making a lot of progress, you sort of beat your head against the wall and things that are just never going anywhere. Pick some things that are new that you can show some leadership on. So there's a little diagram about how to develop an agenda. So you have 2 dimensions to the issues you're going to be picking. The impact, these high impact issues, are they low impact? And doability, how easy is it to get these things done? So it gives you a little 2x2 matrix. So we'll start with the lower right-hand corner, things that are low impact and hard to get done. Why would you waste your time doing those things? But you'd be surprised how often people will actually spend time on things that are really difficult and ultimately won't actually have much payoff. Be wary of those things. They can creep into the process. Always be asking yourself, is this really, particularly if it's really hard, is it really going to have the impact we want? We spending our time on it? You shouldn't. Now, the opposite corner, the dark green, high impact, easy to get done. These are great, but they're rare. I mean, if they're high impact and easy to get done, they're probably been done by now. I mean, why wouldn't they be done? You're not going to find too many of these. No, they're great. Latch onto them. You might be surprised. Every once in a while, there's some great idea that no one's just ever thought of, and it can be done. Get a lot of opposition, get it done. So, but most of the time, you're going to spend your time in the light green boxes. So lower left, low impact, easy to get done. You need some victories. You can't always be doing the hard stuff. You got to find something that, focus on it, focus your time and energy on something that's going to get done. And not a lot of opposition. Maybe it doesn't have a lot of impact, but you need to have some victories. You need to show your constituencies, your members, that you're able to get things done. The opposite corner, these are the stretch goals, the high impact, difficult things. This is the new freeway interchange or the new road expansion that's going to open up developable areas. This is getting a new park built that's really going to enhance the quality of life and get rents up or whatever. So these are the things that are difficult, but you need some of them because as a leadership group, you need to show some leadership and be getting out there really trying to do the difficult things. So you're going to have some combination of the 2 light green boxes is probably what your agenda is going to end up looking like. And as I said earlier, try to come up with some things that are new as you're doing this, not the same old stuff, to show some leadership. So developing your agenda is the first non-negotiable item. you want to have that as a physical document. I'm still a big fan of hard copy. You need to be able to, when you go in front of a council, you need to be able to handle the hard copy of your agenda. And it needs to be professionally done in the sense of, you know, easy to read, well written, and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't have to be super long or fancy. Don't get hung up on that. You don't need picture glossy stuff. You also want to have it on your website. You want to have email versions of this you're sending around. You want to have lots of different formats. But that's item number one, non-negotiable, is the agenda. Item number two, this non-negotiable, is regular things, the decision makers. Okay? Everybody in your orbit who makes decisions, whether it's in city council members or senior administrators, you want to have regular meetings at least once a year, if not more often. Okay? There's a page in the booklet about how to have effective. Remember, the meeting is not the end in itself. The meeting is the middle of a three-stage process where you prepare for the meeting, you have the meeting, and you do the follow-up from the meeting. The work is on both ends. One of the things my father told me when I was very getting into the business, he said, remember, or you can work. So the meeting is not the work is what happens before the meeting, is where you communicate and make your points. So the meetings with elected officials, appointed officials, these are mostly friendly. These where you're not asking for something necessarily. If there's something you got to ask for it. But if it's not, you're just saying, hey, here's our agenda. You give them the agenda. Here's what we stand for. Here's what we want. How can we be helpful to you? You know, what's coming up in the city that we could be helpful to you, and that relationship building part. Have those meetings. What's an interesting part about meetings is the turf, where you hold the meeting. I think this is really important, and I don't lose sight of this. There's sort of three ways you can do this. You can have the meeting in City Hall or the courthouse or administration building. That's their turf. You can have it on your turf. You can invite them to meet in your offices. Or you can meet a neutral, say, coffee or lunch or something. That's an important question. It'll play out absolutely differently with everybody, so I can't tell you how it plays out. Just be cognizant that it does matter and where you does matter. And think through with that individual, where's the best place to meet? If they're the sort of imperious person, you know, always in charge, you don't want to meet a turf because you'll get a role. You know? You want to meet in a place where you don't so in charge. If they're a relaxed, easygoing person, fine, meet in their office. You don't worry about that, but it's going to be different for different people. Put together the right people to have those meetings. Again, it's that relationship building. So you have maybe someone who knows the council member personally. You want to have them there. You want to have people from your leadership there. You know, who's the board president or government relations chair, staff, whatever, you know, whoever the right 2 or 3 people are to have in the meeting. You want to make sure that you're there. You want to be prepared so that when you go into the meeting, it's your agenda, not their agenda. You know, you've asked for the meeting, you own it, it's your agenda. Don't let them, you know, roll you with their agenda. And then, of course, the follow-up. You know, you've asked for additional information, they've asked for additional information. Make sure that that follow-up happens. So you're going to do those meetings. You do them at least once a year. They're with council members, with senior administrators, you know, city managers, city planners, public works directors, finance directors, whoever are the key decision makers. You want to do that. The turf course is interesting. I remember a conversation years ago when I was at the with a senior guy, a very senior bureaucrat, you know, powerful guy, who admitted that he was nervous to the chamber. It's like he'd been summoned. And I thought, well, that's cool, because I didn't think we were very intimidating, but apparently we were. And then finally report back on those things. You know, the meeting is part of the information you hear and the points you make is part of your process. You know, write an email to the, you know, to the team, to the rest of the organization about what you learned. So that's item number 2, non-negotiable, is meet everybody that you have to meet with at least once a year. Item number 3, it goes back to what I was just talking about coalition building. Always be out there finding your friends and cultivate friends. So you can imagine there's a coming up, whatever it is, like my median down the road, you know, there's a vote coming up. You want people to testify to support that vote. You think, okay, head of this human service, great, this is right up their alley. But if you haven't spoken to them in a year or two, and then you ask them to show up and testify for you, that's not going to work very well. They won't think very highly of that. But if that's a person you know well, you make a point of sitting next to them at the Rotary Club meeting, or you make a point of, you see them at your kid's soccer game and you go chat with them, and you built a relationship over time. They're aware of the agenda. You've sent them then when you go to call on them, they're much more likely to be receptive and helpful. So keep building that coalition. And again, go back to the parade idea. Those people are changing all the time. Every time there's a new person in a position, in an institutional position that's going to be helpful to you, go find them, seek them out, make sure they understand what you're doing and how their predecessor was helpful to you, and you want to be helpful to them and build a relationship that's going to pay off in the future. So those are the three pieces that are, again, absolutely non-negotiable. You've got to do them as part of any kind of a program. Then there's a lot of other things you can do. One of the things is this idea of information that you have that nobody else has is just a statistical update. You get data on, sales and population changes and all that stuff that you get time. Nobody else gets that, or if they do, they pay attention to it. So, keep a point, describe what's going on in housing and housing markets, and making put it on your website, out once a quarter, whatever it takes. The presentations you make is kind of available for people. You take this stuff, they actually don't. And people are always surprised at this kind of stuff. There's, we're down to a, 3 week supply of housing here. What's going on? Rents have gone up, rents have gone down. People need to know that stuff. So that's one thing you can do. This not terribly difficult. Once you template going, the sources, it's not difficult to update it. And I think it can be very effective. Second thing you can do is take advantage of the open mic times meetings. Every legislative body has a time when the public can come up and talk for 2 or 3 minutes, whatever they give you. And it's a time when you can engage in that friendly relationship building. You're not getting up there to harangue them. I was all surprised at the number of people who get up in front of the council when I was on it and just yell at us. I'm like, what are you trying to accomplish here? We don't respond to that. Be friendly, and that's a good time. If you have some statistic updates, that's a good time to bring them. Say, hey, did you know that this happened? Tell them a story. Say, hey, my colleague just got this wonderful family, new to the area, just moved here, got them into this house, and they're great people, and kids are going to the school. She's really looking forward to coaching the soccer team. Tell them a story. Just kind of, it's a time you can say anything you want, be positive, be supportive, be helpful, tell them the stuff you've done to support the community. Say, hey, we had a great time with the festival last week and we were proud to support it. And I saw you there and glad you had a good time. Do anything you can, but take advantage of that. That's free time to get people knowing who you are and comfortable with you and knowing supporting the community. Use your board meetings and committees as a chance to meet with these important people. So invite the planning director to your board meeting. Not the part where you're talking top secret stuff, but just invite him in to meet your board. They like doing that stuff. Invite the mayor or the council members or whoever it is that's that you think is important. Invite them to your meetings to hear from your people. That's an easy thing to do, and I think appreciate being kind of let inside thing and learning what you do and meeting the people other than the ones they might see at those meetings. Invite the key staff for more detailed briefings. They're working on a lot of stuff. Invite them into your turf. So that's important. Have a meeting with your government affairs committee. Invite the public works director in. What are all the public works things they're working on? How can you be helpful in building support for those projects? So get them in there and get them talking to you about what's important to them. You're going to talk to what's important to you at other times, but they will appreciate a chance to tell you what they're working on and where they need help. We used to do something at the Seattle Chamber that was a lot of fun, and it was the annual public officials reception. It was simply a cocktail party, usually in early December. So it was after the election. People have been elected. They haven't taken their seats yet if they're new. You invite people into a cocktail party. It's very simple. There's no agenda. There's no speakers. There's no podium. It's your members and your friends talking to the people making decisions. This is a chance to show your appreciation for them. get to know them in an informal setting. It's not difficult to do, and they'll show up. People eat free hors d'oeuvres. They'll show up. They'll get to, and it's informal and non-threatening, and it's a good way, particularly for new council, but also ones who've been around a while, as well as appointed officials. I think the ethics rules allow them to come to things like that and have some canapes at your expense. So those are all things you can do. There's a whole bunch more listed in the booklet. But again, going back to my earlier point about make sure that you scale the program, what you're doing, to something that's sustainable over time. So if you don't think you can do these things, if you one thing that happens in associations I've observed, you'll get a super energetic board president one year, and they just want to do everything. And then the next year you've got someone who's maybe a little less energetic or busier or whatever. So make sure that what you're doing is sustainable over time, over changes in leadership, over different budget cycles when you may have more or less money to work with. So that's the end of what I've got. We have a few minutes left for questions. If anybody has questions, comments, things I didn't cover, things that made no sense at all, now's the time.
Any questions? Or enter in the chat. Well, if there's no questions, I will let Jeanette give a quick wrap up. We'll let folks get out of here.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeanette McKay with Washington Realtors, and I just want to thank you for attending this class. I just wanted to also let you know that the reason we developed this class was because we know how important it is to work at the local level on housing. So we're hoping that this provides you with the framework and tools you need to be successful with all the cities that are doing their comp plans right now and their development regulations. And also I wanted to let you know that we're always available to help out too with any issues or topics that you have. And finally, the last thing I want to do is just remind you to fill out your surveys, since this is the first time we've done this type of class. So thanks a lot. Thank you, Rachel. And have a good day. Take care.
Thank you all so much. You will be receiving an email after this presentation wraps up with the booklet and the survey to complete. So if you could complete that as soon as possible, that would be great. And once again, thank you, Mike Lewis, for taking time out of your day to give this really helpful and super informative presentation. I know we all appreciated it.
Well, it was great. And the thunderstorm seems to have abated, so I guess we're not going to have a power outage here. Thanks.
We lucked out. All right. Thank you all. That concludes the meeting for today.